Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming on a Friday. We are going to conclude our discussion on race with a segment on identity, and then we're going to go from identity to privacy, and that's just a natural transition there. Identity. What is identity? Identity is made up of so many different things. I have actually I'm going to update my PowerPoint, and you can see it's ethnicity, culture, sex, religion, morals, lifestyle, and so much more. The components of identity really are how we perceive ourselves. Do we perceive ourselves by our race? Do we perceive ourselves by our family affiliation, our lifestyle, or some cultural aspect? All this is a combination. Identity is made up of so many different things: conscience, consciousness, and so forth. There are pluses and minuses to identity. Sometimes identity is what others perceive us to be by the way we look, the color of our skin, for instance, the accent or lack of accent that we have when we speak. So identity is one of these aspects that we have to spend some time looking at. There is a philosophical definition of identity. First, I want to share with you the definition of what identity is, and then we're going to take a look at something else here. So identity is how we perceive ourselves via consciousness, natural law. How do we see ourselves? It could be related to a common heritage, an ethnic, lifestyle, racial, or other affinity. It's a combination. These are the components of identity. It's a combination of consciousness, our awareness, our conscience that speaks to us. Remember this, our public, private, and secret self, that voice that is always talking to us, sex preference, cultural, generational, familiar, theological. It's so much more than one thing. Now, it's been my experience teaching ethics and writing about identity that sometimes we feel so strongly our identity is so strongly associated with one particular thing that we cannot live up to its obligations. There is another way. For instance, I'm Maltese, right? And I'm Maltese American, and I feel a very strong affinity to Malta, but I can't speak the language, or at least very well. So I can't always live up to what my identity wants me to be. And that's the problem with strong affinities to identity. Now, I'm going to show you a philosophical way to look at identity that I think might help us out.
My name is Elizabeth Camp. I teach philosophy at Rutgers University, and today I want to talk to you about narrative theories of personal identity. Personal identity is one of the first and most fundamental questions of philosophy. Who am I? What makes me, me? These questions are inherently compelling, and they're bound up with practical matters that each of us must decide for ourselves. But when philosophers turn to the question, their answers often feel disappointingly abstract. They typically approach personal identity as a special case of a more general topic in metaphysics by asking, what are the conditions on the preservation and annihilation of this entity? And they typically answer the question using the standard method of far-fetched thought experiments. So, let's imagine a woman, Aletha. She was born in El Paso, let's say, works at a pharmaceutical company, likes spicy food, and kickboxes for fun. Now, let's ask, if her body were annihilated and a molecule-for-molecule replica was simultaneously created on Mars, would it still be her? Not just someone fitting the same description, but her? Now imagine that all of her memories and desires were switched with the Queen of England's. Which one would be her? What if the two hemispheres of her brain were transplanted into the skulls of two cadavers? Who would she be? These are interesting questions, but the leading views of personal identity, that I am my body and that I am a thread of overlapping psychological states, have a hard time coming up with consistent explanations of all these cases. More distressingly, though, they don't even address the questions that led many of us to care about the self in the first place. The kinds of features they propose for what makes me, me, are basically the same as what makes Aletha, Aletha, and what makes you, you. They thus explain why each of us are individuals in the sense of being numerically distinct, because we're located at different spatiotemporal locations and we have different other properties. But the same point goes for billiard balls, or at least for rabbits. They don't even begin to explain why the differences between us are interesting and important. This is where the narrative view of personal identity comes in. It starts from the idea that we're fundamentally sense-making creatures, homo neurans, as John Niles put it, tellers instead of homo sapiens, or knowers. On a narrative view, who I am is given by the story I tell about myself, or maybe, to guard against rampant self-deception, by the story that an especially honest, reflective version of myself would tell. Think about the sorts of things we tell each other on first dates and at parties and in our memoirs. Where we come from, what's happened to us so far, where we're headed. When I ask myself, who am I? I'm asking how to shape the story of my life so that it hangs together into a meaningful, well-rounded whole. Because the narrative view treats selves as constructed out of a multitude of remembered details and plans, it explains our sense that some actions and features are deeply part of us, while others are accidents. Say that Aletha's love of science is central to her identity, while working at Big Pharma is just a way to pay the rent. It also explains the profound intuition that making a self is an active, ongoing process. So, perhaps as a teenager or in college, Aletha might describe herself as from the barrio, but later she might decide that she just happened to be born there, that it doesn't define her or even much matter. Finally, because it focuses on the particularities of individual selves and their specific places at given moments in an overall life's journey, the narrative view explains the intimate, intuitive connection between figuring out who we are and what we should do. The best action for Aletha now is the one that most fully actualizes the particular self she is in the midst of becoming. Maybe this means going back to graduate school. Maybe it means starting a nonprofit. Maybe it means saving up to buy a house. Only she can decide, and different decisions may set her off on very different paths, producing later selves with incompatible interests and values. Given how explanatorily rich it is, it shouldn't be surprising that the narrative view has been endorsed by a wide range of philosophers, psychologists, anthropologists, historians, and literary critics. However, there's a problem. What the narrative view really explains is the identity and significance of lives, not the identity and significance of selves. What is the problem? Well, the most basic feature of a narrative, as Aristotle tells us, is that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Narrative structure is teleological. Events in the narrative hang together and gain their significance because of their relation to the story's end, and helping to bring it about, stymieing its culmination, and so on. But because the narrative view defines a self in terms of the narrative it's embedded within, it ends up holding the meaning and the value of that self hostage to the story's end. One problem is that many lives, maybe even most, end at inopportune time.
I want to talk a little bit about this. I know most of us in the class are looking at the future. You know, what am I going to become? What job will I have? How do I define myself? This video is worth looking at in its entirety. Okay. Now, there are two ways to tell a story, and I want you to. We're going to switch over to narrative storytelling for a minute. And we're going to relate it to identity, and then we'll look at something else, a lyrical way of telling the story. I'm going to use my English background on this. So let's just start first. We're going to be talking about identity, but we're going to be using a narrative metaphor. Once more, you see, when she mentions Aristotle, the Western way of thinking, that we are going to make bucket lists of things we're going to do in life, but what if we fail to achieve them? What if we continually aspire to be something and it just never happens for us? What if we're on looking at social media and everybody's getting married or getting jobs or finding their soulmate? We know a lot of that stuff on social media is false anyway, but we can't keep up with our list of what we should be. Do you remember when we talked about sometimes the problems of making lists? I even included a little bit of that in the discussion article and a column that I published in the Iowa Dispatch. The problem with lists is, what if we don't fulfill them? The coronavirus has sent us a really good message about lists. Sometimes our lists are never going to materialize. Likewise, sometimes our goals will not materialize. Sometimes the identity by which others judge us cannot be achieved. There is another way of looking at identity. So let's go back to my English background, and I mean my English PhD. You know, Shakespeare is considered one of the best storytellers ever. And what he did is he had a plot. Every one of his plays has a plot. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. And he tells a narrative story. This happens, then that happens. There's Romeo meets Juliet, and so far, so on. His rival at the time was another playwright called Ben Jonson. And Ben Jonson said, why do you have to tell a story with a plot? That this happens and this happens and this happens. All you have to do is get two characters with different personalities, put them in a room, and their character alone will create the story, as in a situation comedy. Rather than looking at our lives and our identity as things we can achieve in a Western way, some of us, and I'm not asking that you do this, I'm asking you that you consider identity from two different ways. Go back to Mencius and the idea of what type of lists we should make. Instead of making a to-do list, we might want to make a list of intentions or a list of the values we want to develop in ourselves. Likewise, a lyric way of looking at yourself is as a character and character development. I am going to create a better version of my truth-telling, a better version of my compassion, my empathy, my forgiveness. That's called character development. And in journalism and mass communication, character development is actually part of an ad campaign. It's part of a PR campaign. It's part of a human interest story. So when we look at identity, we might want to stop with the lists of what we're going to graduate and we're going to get this job and we're going to get married at this age, or we're going to find a soulmate at this age. We're going to go to Europe at this time. The coronavirus tells us that we're not in control of many things. It's a good lesson for us. So instead, what I have tried to do, and I have found it useful, is to create a better version of me, a more ethical version of me. And at one time in my life, I measured myself by titles, by awards, and the awards that you might see in my office came long after I gave up wanting to achieve an award. It just came as a result of developing my character. So think of identity in this way and see if it's helpful to you. Now, I have some other things here before we conclude on race and ethnicity. I put some links here. We're going to go to them. This here is guidelines. You will see guidelines to avoid stereotypes. These are very important questions you should ask yourself on a campaign. if something comes up and you have some doubts about a campaign or a story, is there someone I can check with? Uh, is there any resource? These are just some recommendations for you, and I don't want to spend time going over them, but they are guidelines that you can use to avoid stereotypes. Then I included another link here that you might want to see, and this is a journaling exercise. It lists the highs, lows, and turning points of your life involving race, sex, gender, disability, social class. This is a very nice journaling exercise that you can do. And for the journalists here, there's this Newswatch Diversity Style Guide, but it also works for public relations and advertising. So there's a style guide that you can see, idioms, phrases, things of that nature. Some very useful links. Now, what we're going to do is make a transition from identity to privacy. Privacy is something we have to all consider. In fact, Hugo and I had to dialogue about this new Zoom bombing phenomenon that's happening. There are some trolls who will break into a class. I think they did this at the University of Texas with racist words or even pornography, just anything puerile to disrupt a classroom. So, Hugo and I were talking about how to fend that off. We want to discuss privacy as well. We're getting into for the next couple of lessons, we're going to get into some really upsetting things. We're going to be talking about cyberbullying today, harassment and stalking. I've put some statistics here. 1 in 3 students report being bullied during their high school years. These statistics are just awful, but they're not surprising. I'm trolled. In fact, the director of the school, Michael Dahlstrom, somebody was trying to impersonate him to buy gift cards. It just happens so often today. Here is a particularly upsetting case about Olympian Gabby Douglas, probably one of the best gymnasts in the world, or that we'll see in a long, long time. A sad affair. I want to talk to you again about trolls. Just if a person matters to you, if it's your supervisor, if it's a colleague, if it's a workplace issue, you have to deal with it one way or another. If it's a family member, for instance, or a cousin or whatever, you have to deal with criticism, and you should have confidence and composure when you do that. I want to mention to you the whole idea of trolling. We're talking about um, harassment. We're not talking about uh, stalking, which is much more serious. I get anybody these days who puts themselves in the public domain are going to be a target of these of trolls. That's even happening with Dr. Fauci, and he has to have security because he's talking about the coronavirus from a scientific rather than political perspective. Very sad situation. But I have found that when someone trolls you, what they're trying to do is bring you down to their level, while you, if you answer them, you bring them up to yours. So ignoring is one of the best things you can do. But when it gets serious, when it's affecting your outlook, your workplace, or anything of that nature, you have to bring it to a supervisor or figure out a way to get it to stop. So we're going to talk now about the various types of, this is cyberbullying, and these are the terms. Cyber harassment is thought not, these are perpetual harassers. Every time you go on, for instance, every time on Facebook, I might put something, there'll be somebody who's going to criticize it. You can block them and they'll figure a way how to come back. That is harassment. It's perpetual. People continue to harass you and get on your nerves to such extent that it affects your performance, but it's not deemed a credible threat. A credible threat is when someone, someone is out there to harm you. These are really this is an important distinction. There's bullying, then there's harassment, kind of a perpetual harassment of you, and then there is this stalking issue. So these are all defined in this lecture, and including on some of the harassment figures are pretty disturbing. Look at the statistics here that students usually go through: offensive name calling, purposeful embarrassment, physical threats, sustained harassment, stalking. Any of these issues is enough to put you in a bad mood or a fearful mood, and that can affect your performance at the workplace. I want to talk a little bit about cyber stalking statistics, and then we're gonna look at a video about how threatening this actually can be. These are scary statistics. This is a report that I think is worth looking at. It's on what happened to a certain individual. I want to give you a warning in case you want to turn off your video, that some of the images are stark and upsetting.
The dark side of social media, and one woman's nightmarish struggle over several years to elude her stalker. Hers is a chilling case, starting with the way she was approached with a friend request on Facebook from a former college classmate. Their interaction quickly took a disturbing turn, and then, as the ominous tweets and YouTube posts piled up, it took over her life. Here's ABC's Andrea Cannon.
Please just listen to me and let me be nice. We need to talk face to face.
The videos are disturbing and terrifying.
That's a very, very unwise decision. It's up to you now. Save your own life.
Patrick Mashoni posted dozens of threatening tirades on YouTube,
You stupid, ungrateful piece of...
all directed at one woman.
In sickness and in health, until the day you die.
His obsession, former college student Kristen Pratt.
It stops you in your tracks. It just kills you emotionally.
For 3 years, Patrick Mashoni used social media as his weapon, cyber-stalking Pratt through YouTube. Messages like these: I want to tie your wrists together. I'm going to follow you home from work. And tweets like this one: it is up to you now to save your life. I have no options. Not to mention dozens of phone calls a day. Pratt worried for her life.
Describe what that's like to be paranoid 24 hours a day.
Makes you question the world around you, and it instills fear.
Would you check the shower? Would you check the closet? When you
Oh
came
yeah, I
home?
would check all the time. I used to have dreams that he found out where I lived and broke into my house and waited till I went to sleep and would kill me.
It all began out of the blue in 2008 when Mashoni contacted Pratt, then 19 years old, on Facebook, reminding her they had taken a class together 2 years earlier at a community college. They had never even officially met. She says the conversation was initially polite.
You were innocently responding to him,
Yeah.
thinking could be a friend.
Yeah, exactly.
But about a half dozen messages later, things quickly turned frightening.
They were more sexually oriented and a little bit more deranged. Stuff about how he wanted to kill me before I kill him. Or he would break my neck, my boyfriend's neck.
The stalking only escalated.
You're still playing games!
In this video, you can see Mashoni videotaping himself in front of Pratt's work. She then drives by, not even knowing he's there. He chases her. Pratt was told outside of a restraining order there was little she could do until a police officer arrested Mashoni for prowling at another apartment complex.
We asked if he could check Patrick's backpack. And in the backpack was a sexual device, condoms, porn, and a video camera.
Mashoni was finally charged with cyber stalking, and last week Pratt faced him in court.
I was always nervous and frightened that at any moment I could walk out of a building and nobody would ever see me again.
What was it like having to be face to face with this man?
You're still playing games!
Really scary. I was breathless. It took my breath. I couldn't breathe.
You can't keep ignoring me. You can't.
Mashoni was convicted of cyber stalking. He took a plea deal. The prosecution asked for 15 years, arguing Mashoni is a danger to society if released too soon from prison.
I know what's going to happen. He will kill her.
The defense painted a picture of a once bright and promising student with a college scholarship who went on a downward spiral, a man who needs medical help, not prison time. Mashoni, now 24 years old, admitted in court he has problems.
Well, I want to apologize to her, definitely for scaring her. I honestly don't even remember, like, any of those emails I didn't. I mean, obviously, I'm not making it up.
The judge gave Mashoni 4 years. He will be out in just 2 for time served.
He made it a point to say it was because this is Patrick's first offense. He hasn't harmed me. I'm still alive. But I'm not alive because Patrick didn't want to hurt me. I'm alive because I...
Very disturbing image there, and a court case I want to put here for you Iowa law concerning stalking, if ever this happens to you. It's important for you to know the law of any state that you are going to work in. It's important for you to know Iowa State's treatment of harassment and so forth. But I've included the law here to you. The whole idea of privacy invasion. Privacy invasion is to attack our identity, to make us question our own identity if we think that we are a good teacher. A troll will try to say you're a horrible teacher. If we think that we're a good journalist, a troll will make you think you're a terrible journalist. And it could be even a colleague too, with a type of bullying. Remember what my motto is on this. My motto is basically, don't feed the trolls. You've heard that before. But also keep in mind that you have to defend yourself. Remember Dr. B's philosophy of no. No, you will not do that. There are times when you have to show courage. And part of the courage might be filing a grievance against someone. Always protect yourself. It's important to protect your identity. That is true. You don't want people defining you for yourself. You want to define yourself in your identity. But what I'm saying here is be courageous for yourself. Stand up for yourself. There are people in our class, and I know them from our discussions, very wonderful people who are always serving other people. And before you can be an effective, to show empathy to others, to serve others, before you can do that, you've got to serve yourself. You are the most important person. If you can take care of yourself internally, you can help others. So we have this age of incivility now. And I've written a couple of things on the discussion board about that. You know, it's important sometimes to go back to some of the founders of this country and what they had hoped our lives in the future would be. Let's take a small look at this video and then we'll summarize it for you.
About the history of what we just did there, that ceremonial handshake. After all, it actually goes back quite a long ways, but we really don't think about it when we do it much, do we? We stick out our hand and we pump it up and down, touching a stranger. That's kind of funky, isn't it, when you think about it? Well, it actually goes back to about 70 BC. And evidence of it is in ancient Greek and Roman art. It shows men coming off of the battlefield, meeting for a truce at the center of a battlefield, and they would take off their armament, their long gloves, their protection, to show there was nothing up their sleeve, because those daggers and knives get in the way of a good truce. Now we have Facebook and fist bumps. And I don't know about you, and fist bumps could be quite hygienic, I suppose, and very hip and kind of fun, but that doesn't really scream, I come in peace, does it? This is all about the world of civility, and all of these conventions that we do to connect ourselves together a little bit is civility. They are protocols that we go through without thinking much about them, but maybe we will. Protocol means first glue, and that's the glue that binds us together. It's a great word because it talks about a bond, the beginning of a relationship. George Washington, our first president, actually was kind of hip to this subject when he was about 16 years old. What he did was he went through French manuscripts that were about etiquette and manners. He culled through them. They were written maybe 200 years before he was even born. He put them together into what was now known as the George Washington Rules of Civility. Now, some of those rules are...
once again, we get the idea of America as an experiment, and our rights. I mean, the founders, they had their own issues. They had their own immoralities. That is absolutely documented and a fact. But the interesting thing about our country is that it was created for the future, and civility was hoped to be programmed. Here are some of George Washington's rules of civility. Trust, respect, courtesy, dignity, and honor. And we see that dignity, that proto-norm, normic value coming up. Here are some of George Washington's hope for the country and how we would treat each other. Every action done in the company of others ought to be done with some sign of respect. Show nothing to your friend that might affright him. Read no letters, books, or papers in company, but when there is a necessity for doing so, you must ask leave. Well, that can relate to the cell phone, right? Reproach none for the infirmities of nature, disabilities. Show not yourself glad at the misfortune of others, and so forth. It's important to take a look at some of those tenets of civility. But when we look at ourselves and our character and our identity, I have tried to be more trustworthy. I try to show people respect, even if they don't show me the same. I try to be courteous to others. If they're not courteous to me, I still say hello to people. If they don't say hello to me, the one less thing, but that's not going to change my greeting all colleagues with a hello. Fairness and integrity are important. And humility. Humility is a character trait that's associated with courage, integrity, strong leadership, composure, self-control. And many of you understand humility as a value. It's a good familiar value that you might have learned. These are all important in the wake of being trolled, and important to keep a firm grip on our own identity. This is George Washington's motto: labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. That celestial fire, I think, is important. I want to give us a primer on privacy law. I am not going to show this video. You might want to take a look at it. Right now, we are seeing privacy law being used to shut down websites. This is a pretty vile incident of privacy invasion. Erin Andrews is another case, a sports writer who had her privacy violated with a peephole in a camera. All this stuff is just too upsetting to show, but it's here if you would like to look at it. I put summaries under this in case you're interested in this case. We have privacy protections. I think privacy protections are very important. The right to privacy is not guaranteed in the Constitution. It is, some will argue that the Fourth Amendment, that we should be secure in our homes, in our persons, is the constitutional version of privacy. But it comes to us really through case law. And I'm going to show a little bit of this, and then I have summarized it for you.
Welcome to lecture number 1. Today we will discuss the origins and definitions of privacy. The word privacy is found nowhere in the Constitution, but has been inferred to exist from several of the original Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, which protects the right to anonymous speech, the Third Amendment, which protects the privacy of the home by preventing the government from requiring citizens to house soldiers in their homes in times of peace, and the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. The concept of privacy was widely recognized in a famous Harvard Law Review article written in 1890 by Samuel Warren, a prominent Boston lawyer, and Louis Brandeis, who later became a justice of the United States Supreme Court. The article was written in the context of an increasingly sensationalist press, so-called yellow journalism, which focused on reporting about prominent members of society in lurid detail. Warren reportedly was the subject of several articles by the Saturday Evening Gazette in Boston about his lavish dinner parties. Warren and Brandeis described the privacy right as, quote, the right to be left alone, end of quote. The right of privacy defies a single definition and has been defined in many ways over the years by various commentators and courts. Many of the definitions overlap each other, but may be summarized as encompassing the following rights. The right of solitude. This is Warren and Brandeis' famous formulation of the right to be left alone. People need to be insulated from the world and others on certain occasions. This is a form of preventing trespass to one's physical, emotional, and mental world and causing injuries which Brandeis argued can be more harmful than bodily injuries. The right of intimacy, which is simply the ability to control or limit access to one's intimate relationships or information. This is the basis for protecting activities in the home, relationships with loved ones, and medical information. The right of secrecy, which addresses the ability to conceal certain information or matters from others. This is often related to the right of intimacy, but is grounded on the belief that there is value in preventing disclosure of certain types of information, even if not intimate. For example, what organizations one belongs to or what videos one watches. The right to limit access to the self. This is the ability to shield oneself from unwanted access by others. This formulation of privacy underlies the current concerns with geolocation tracking. The right to control information about oneself. This formulation is perhaps the most all-encompassing definition and speaks to the ability to determine what personal information is shared with others. This is at the forefront of the modern controversies over data mining and tracking of
as you can see, we agree to terms of service that are that violate control of information about ourselves. One of the worst cases is TikTok. If you use TikTok, you ought to read what you're agreeing to. Anyway, I have listed the case law here for you, and I want you to think about that in terms of what's important to you and how to protect yourself. You know, it just, there's so many things here that we need to go over in terms of digital and street harassment. And I'm going to wait to do that until next time. I do want to tell you, though, however, it's important for you to be able to protect yourself. And I want to talk a little bit about what happens if you are in a workplace and someone is harassing you. And you know, sometimes supervisors can harass you. And if it's impacting your work and creating a hostile work environment so that you can't complete your work, you have to take a look at whether or not it's reportable. If it's persistent, if it's pervasive, if there's any personal things that are said about you, then you have to maybe have at least a confidential visit with human resources. And in your personal life, be careful what you share with others. And remember the philosophy of no. Make sure your boundaries are protect yourself and protect the secrecy of what's in your heart. You should confide your heart to those with whom you have a good bond of trust. All these things are going to be challenged throughout your life. And if you're a supervisor and you're dealing with somebody who really does have a mental illness, you can't just say, oh, that person is mentally ill and that's why he or she is doing that. You have to just treat the behavior. If the behavior violates some standard of human relationships at the workplace, some standard that's in your handbook, then you have to deal with it as a violation and not consign it to a medical condition. Remember, we all are going through different things in our lives. So we'll pick up with street harassment. And it's something that, unfortunately, the women in our class have got to live through. And I think it's important to understand the various shades of this, from street harassment to revenge porn and now to deep fakes, which I think are just an awful development with technology. Hugo, do you want to have the last word before we sign off?
I just want to say a word about the email that Dr. B sent out. There's just a couple questions on there. You're going to answer those. I believe it's your portfolio URL. We still haven't received everyone's. We're still missing some. Your portfolio URL, and then also I believe it is if you give us permission to use it. And then lastly, let us know if you would like it to be graded a little bit early. We can get started on that. But other than that, just be on the lookout for the email and please reply to that.
Thank you, Hugo. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe in regards to your families. Thank you.